Hello, welcome back to these lectures on Exodus, Jewish immigration from Russia, 1881 to about 1924. Now, in our last lecture, we saw what a large percentage of Jews in the world lived in the Pale of Settlement, in terrible conditions, with so much discrimination and restrictions against them. But then we noted the assassination of Tsar Alexander II and the rumor that spread through Russia that the Jews were behind this plot, and the violent pogroms that commenced. The Jews needed to escape, but as we've noted, the poverty of the Jews prevented so many from moving. To move legally, you needed money and a lot of time to wait for your paperwork, and would even this be approved. For instance, a ticket from Hamburg, Germany to New York at that time cost $34. Which was more than many Jews earned in a year in the Pale. And that was just the passage. They needed more money to get to a port for the ship, and other costs in settling. To move illegally through borders, you also needed a lot of seed and bribe money, and there were dangerous risks for your family. Another difficulty besides poverty was that some of the rabbis and other devout Jews were urging other Jews not to leave for other nations because of the stories of worldliness they were hearing about. You know, the music, entertainment, having to work on the Sabbath. It's better to die in the Pale than to lose your Jewish faith. Anyway, those who left went to many places. Here's a good map and chart of this, showing those places and the amount of Jews. This map doesn't show two other destinations that should be noted, namely Western Europe with about 240,000 and Australia with about 5,000. And you can see some Jews were able to get to Palestine. For instance, 30 Ukrainian Jews actually made it to Palestine in 1882, where they farmed. They grew to 48 persons, and this was the first aliyah, or like the first return in modern times to the land of Israel. Of those 48, one person was young enough to witness the creation of Israel in 1948. 73% of Jewish immigrants to the United States between 1880 and 1920 came from the Russian Empire. 7% went to Western Europe, 12% to Canada, Argentina, South Africa, or Palestine, but about 80% came to the United States. And let me show you this wonderful chart by Natalia Bronstein. Here is the history of immigration to the United States in living color. We can see the decades on the bottom, and the colors represent the different nations, and the size of the shape, the amount of people arriving. Notice Russia here in the red after 1881, first 400,000 in one decade, and then 1.5 million, then 1.1 million in the next decade. This big red mass in the middle is a very clear picture of the results of the mass pogroms and persecution of the Russian Jews. Notice also the bubble from Austria-Hungary, over 1 million. Many of these were Jews on the run. And this big swell in immigration is the time period we're focused upon and was the reason for Ellis Island. The knowledge of this severe persecution certainly came to the attention of the heads of state around the world, and certainly to our American presidents in those years, Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, and Benjamin Harrison. The Immigration Act of 1891 under Benjamin Harrison brought immigration under the control of the federal government for the first time. And out of this came the larger facility at Ellis Island in 1892. Unfortunately, there was no action out of these presidents to give Russia any reason to halt these human rights abuses. The closest action was by President Benjamin Harrison. President Harrison said in his annual message to Congress on December 9, 1891, This government has found occasion to express in friendly spirit, but with much earnestness, to the government of the Tsar its concern because of the harsh measures being enforced against the Hebrews in Russia. Our historic friendship for that government cannot fail to give assurance that our representations are those of a sincere well-wisher. Well, okay, this well-wishing advice was obviously easy to brush off by the Russian government, which they did. In 1891, President Harrison named a 5-member commission headed by John B. Weber, Commissioner of Immigration at the port in New York, to investigate the conditions which had led to the growth in overall immigration to the United States. And in the course of this investigation, Weber and one of his fellow commission members, Dr. Walter Kempster, examined the conditions that led to the mass exodus of Jews from Russia. Weber and Kempster spent 4 weeks in Russia gathering information in August and September 1891. And in their detailed report, they put flesh and bones on the anecdotal stories coming out of Russia. The report is long and tedious. It's page after page of very restrictive and prescriptive laws concerning the Jews, the trades they were allowed, where they can live, social restrictions, lots of economic limitations. Like even if you had to travel out of the pale for some vital business, like to appear in court or to claim an inheritance, they had to have all these permissions from everywhere that they traveled. The Russians just did not want any Jews functioning freely as individuals anywhere outside of the pale, even for a few days. Jews in the army could not even take their leave in any place but the pale. On February 22, 1892, the House of Representatives received the Weber report, and the timing could not have been more important. As I mentioned, the administration had passed the Immigration Act of 1891, which stated that persons were to be denied entry to the United States if they were likely to become a public charge. Okay, that sounds reasonable for a country to do. However, the Jews from the Pale would have been caught in this law because they were almost all desperately poor, and importantly, many were without a transferable trade to this nation because of the limitations of the Pale. Weber wrote about the Pale of Settlement Jews, quote, "Willing and able to work, they, that is the Jews, are unable to attain it, forbidden to work outside the city, forbidden to trade in the country, unable to leave the precincts where they now are excluded from government work. It is no wonder they wish to fly somewhere where they can breathe and have an equal chance in the struggle for existence. The only things which prevent them from going en masse to other countries is their poverty." End quote. And it was at this time the many Jewish aid agencies convinced the government that no destitute Jews would be a public charge. And this was communicated also to the Ellis Island officials. So our government's contribution to all of this was that at least they did not clamp down upon Russian immigration at this time. The lack of action by the government was what convinced the American Jews that if something was going to be done, they would have to do it themselves. Remember, almost all the American Jews here before the assassination of Tsar Alexander II were from the Central Europe region, Germanic Jews. Remember this chart from the opening slides. Now, were they different in many of their traditions and norms than the Eastern European Jews? Well, yes, of course. And as I've stressed, the Jews coming out of the Pale were strikingly poor and without professional skills. For instance, in 1906, only 50 of the 150,000 East European Jews that came into the United States listed themselves as professionals. Most were manual laborers, with 60% working in the clothing industry. In contrast, the American Germanic Jews had worked for years to educate themselves and to occupy many professional positions. Some of these established Jews in the United States were afraid this new influx of poor and unskilled Jews would provoke a wave of anti-Semitism amidst all the anti-immigration thought already. Some American Jewish leaders were publicly urging Eastern European Jews to stay out of the United States unless they had a viable trade. But other Jewish leaders, like Jacob Schiff and Oscar Strauss, helped the German Jews to reach out generously to these new Jewish immigrants. Strauss was the first Jewish person to hold a cabinet position as the Secretary of Commerce under Theodore Roosevelt. Now, I'm happy to say that many of the Germanic Jews got over that initial scare and resentment of Eastern European Jews emigrating here and tried to help them, especially when they became fully aware of the terrible situation. The American Jewish community must and would take up the noble cause of rescuing East European Jews. Okay. Well, let's break here. In our next lecture, we'll focus on the many ways the American Jewish community would extend help to their needy brothers and sisters in danger. A noble and inspirational story. Thanks very much.